So I'm Jamie, obviously. You're going to have to just bear with me. This is really early. I'm normally in bed at the moment. I'll take a little while to warm up. But thanks for coming along, especially those of you who would also be in bed right now. Thanks, Jade, for inviting me to speak. I have to be honest and say that when I was asked, I kind of immediately said yes. And then as this day drew nearer, I started to think, what have I done? Holy shit, why did I say yes? It would have been so easy just to say no. But then, now I'm sitting here and I realize it's a real privilege to be forced, I guess, to think about your own work in a wider way. We're so busy just doing what we do and doing it kind of intuitively and automatically. It's actually been a really nice process. So that kind of moment of panic has passed, and thanks Jade and Khan and the CreativeMornings team, and thanks Clark, wherever Clark is, who recommended me as well. There he is. Thank you. Moving on. So the theme this month is minimal, which is funny, and Jade's just introduced my work and being minimal and simple. Funnily enough, I actually don't even think of myself as a minimalist at all. In fact, I admire people who can do minimalism beautifully, and when I think of minimalists in a contemporary context, I think of people like John Pawson and Michael Anastasiadis and Daniel Rybecken, and I mean there's plenty more amazing people in that space, but these are all designers, I guess, that have a personal connection with me. This is the work of John Pawson, who just can create such incredible warmth and serenity in the use of very little, and in the hands of somebody less skilled, this kind of visual language could be really sterile and cold, but this is just so incredibly serene. This is also John Pawson, and I should mention that I'm completely obsessed with boats and yachts and the water, and this for me is my complete dream boat. It's incredibly sparse and yet again totally inviting, and to me is the antithesis of how we've been building and designing boats. Everything is so derivative of how we've done it for 100 years, and yet this is a total breath of fresh air. This is also some beautiful minimal work by a Greek designer, a guy called Michael Anastasiadis, who's based in New York, and it's a little hard to see. There's actually a light bulb on the end of that kind of cantilevered arm. You just have to imagine it. This is also Anastasiadis. I've met him once, and he's just a super lovely guy, very honest, very generous, and very straight up, much like his work. His work is just super pure. It's all about just the sphere and the cylinder and the cone and the strength of line, and there's no decoration. It's all just inherent in the materials that he employs. So he's somebody that I really, really admire, and perhaps the most minimal of all of these people that I really admire is Daniel Rybecken, who's a Norwegian designer, and he's so completely reduced that he's not even forming the objects or sculpting the objects, but he's actually sculpting the light. This is a beautiful image. Yeah, I think you can see it. This is a light which is designed to mimic the way light would be cast through a window onto a surface. So here he's not even you can't even see the object. And the most amazing thing about this space is that there's actually no windows or no daylight. It's a completely encapsulated space with no natural light, and yet you could be forgiven for thinking you're in a beautiful atrium. So of all these designers, I just love the sparseness and absoluteness of what they do, and the kind of confidence that comes through that. And me, on the other hand, I don't do that. I guess I think of myself as more of a maximalist, or a maximal. I think of my work as more maximal. I think maximal is a word. It is a word. Yeah, I mean, I do believe less is more, but kind of to a point, and I like to achieve that kind of level of calmness in my work where you do go to that place of reduction and of less, but then I like to kind of season that with something more recognizable, something unique, hopefully something that hasn't been kind of thought of or discovered before. So yeah, I do like to strip things away to the bare essence of a structure, and but it's once I'm kind of at that stripped away point that I just can't restrain myself, and I have to kind of maximize something. I have to find a particular detail and dial it up, and that's kind of for me how I like to operate. And that can be it can be the connection in an object. It can be an engineering principle, or it can be kind of dialing up the silhouette of an object. This is an example. It's a connection that we found that sort of came from thinking about log cabins and how they might be assembled and how could that relate to furniture. And it's not just a frivolous detail. It's worth mentioning that whilst it's kind of expressive and curious to look at, it's actually really incredibly strong. So by using this kind of connection, we can use a thinner gauge of material and create an incredibly stiff structure. So whilst there's this sort of maximalism going on, there is still this tension between the minimal and the maximal, because it's I guess I still like to find that one detail that can really be celebrated and become that kind of heroic focal point, and then try to make sure we don't confuse it with other concepts elsewhere. So it's about finding that, keeping everything else minimal and then just having this maximal kind of element. And also not being able to sort of exercise restraint. I can't help myself but sort of grow my ideas into families, and I think also that relates to the fact that I like the objects I design, and that I like to have a longer term relationship with the objects that I design. And you can see here how that kind of knuckle joint that started with the stool, and I should mention these are all pieces for a local furniture manufacturer, Fletcher Systems, and anyway, coming back to that knuckle joint, it's something that you can see clearly. It's kind of been extrapolated out into a framework for an easy chair on the right there, and then we take that joint and extend it and lay it on its side, and it can become a kind of a tripod for an occasional table. And over time, these pieces they weren't all produced at the same time, but it's a sort of a growing family that continues to grow. And that language evolves as we go. And a good example, I guess, is the little stool is exactly the same as the tall stool, but we chopped the legs off, and it felt a bit kind of extreme to include that kind of knuckle joint there. It felt a bit gratuitous, so we omitted that, and that stool then evolved into a chair, actually the chair that I'm sitting on as well. So you can sort of see that kind of that growth and evolution of this sort of maximal language. The coat stand again is an evolution, and it's a bit different again in that it's not really using that sort of connection, but it's about, I guess, still is about sort of stripping away an object to the bare function, and in this case it's about hanging objects, and once we sort of found a geometry that could work to do the job, it was about sort of I guess making that silhouette as strong and maximal as possible. And for me, whilst it's quite distinctive, it's also a really calm object, and I guess you could associate calm with kind of nothingness, but for me, calmness can also come from a mathematical type of balance, and here I think is a great example where there's a lot of maths going on in this piece. It's each little hook that comes off is increasing by one increment at a time, and as it increases, it also decreases in diameter. And so too does the loading of the actual piece. So you can imagine by the time you get to the top, you have just a hat on the top, and so it only needs to be a very thin dowel, as opposed to the bottom one, which is supporting the load of 6 other things. And speaking of 6, there's 6 branches, and 6 is a number that I have to admit I have an obsession with. I'm terrible at remembering numbers, but I could tell you with a lot of certainty that base will be 360 millimeters by 240 millimeters with a 36 millimeter corner radius. And I think the diameter of the dowel is 36 millimeters, and the ratio is 3:2, which times out to 6. And it's a little bit obsessive. Even somebody was asking me last week about when my birthday is, and I realised it's the 2nd or the 3rd. And there's 6s was my best times table, and it's and the same person then said, "What does that mean? Why are you obsessed with 6s? What does it allow you to do? What does it mean to your practice?" And I think I thought about it for about a week, and I've just realised that I think it just means that I'm a perfectionist and a little bit obsessive. Either that, or I'm like Rain Man. And I can't talk about mathematical balance without acknowledging Alexander Calder, an artist I'm sure we all know, but who has really resonated with me, and in lots of ways. And it's pretty clear. You can see here his use of line and these kind of a lot of beautiful balance, and these kind of fractal like geometries are all things that mean a lot to me. And then equally, from his mobiles to his stabiles, Calder teaches me a lot about how to do heavy, how to do real industrial beautifully. This is an incredible sculpture that's sort of sinuous and light and elegant, and yet it's made from plate steel and rivets and bolts and T-sections and I-beams, and yet it's so soft and expressive. It just, I love this work, and it's something that I think has taught me a lot about how I treat my own sort of approach to the engineered and the engineering within my objects. This is a chair for a Japanese client, which I think sort of expresses that kind of influence quite well. It's pretty simple. It's a seating plane and a backrest, and it's held together by these little brackets. But those brackets become the celebration, and they grow into the legs, and the kind of coring out of the superfluous material is treated in a kind of a sculptural way, where every little fillet and radius is really considered. And I think through that sort of stripping it down to this kind of point of banality, and then finding that kind of engineering detail to really express, is what has allowed this piece to have a really strong silhouette. So those legs suddenly become everything that it's about, and to me it's a really maximal silhouette. It's a really approachable form. It's actually soft, and it's reduced, but it's also maximal. So for me, there's always this kind of tension between the minimal and the maximal. Another approach that I tend to employ sometimes is trying to kind of dial up that little detail that speaks to the magpie in all of us. And this is a kayak that we designed, which is the little details, the little fastenings and the little latch are gold plated, and there's nothing minimal at all about plating things in gold in my mind. I always think of Apple here as well. We always think of Apple as being a company that produces kind of minimal objects, and they're very reduced and pure and clean. But if you look at your iPhone, it's a lump of aluminium that's completely machined and bead blasted or shot blasted, so it's got that lovely texture. And then just the bezel, that little chamfer that runs around the glass, your screen, is polished to within an inch of its life. So when it's anodized, the whole thing is matte, apart from just that little frame of that sort of surface you operate on. So that's completely that little flourish is something that I find they use really well to get their hooks into you, and it's something that I enjoy as well. So again, you could argue that that's maximalism right there. So hopefully, I've probably convinced you now that maybe I'm not a minimalist, and Jade's probably thinking, why did I ask this guy to talk? And having said that I'm not a minimalist, I do think that we run a minimal practice, and I'll come to this in a minute, but I think it's important to maybe talk about a few things in my past that maybe have led me to do what I do down here in this part of the world. I started probably like a lot of designers from this country. I started my career thinking that opportunities existed abroad, and so I left with a couple of years' experience at Fisher & Paykel and headed to Milan, where I got work in an amazing architecture and design studio in the centre of Milan for a company run by an Italian-Japanese named Macchio Haswike. And it was a really magic experience. We worked in an old button factory not far from the Naviglia, not far from the centre of Milan, and it was an amazing time, and it was cut short, I guess, by my being offered a dream job. And I've sort of mentioned that I'm into boats and sailing, and I'm also a mad keen windsurfer. And before even leaving New Zealand, I'd applied for a job with Nike of windsurfing, and a company run by a Hong Kong-based New Zealander called Neil Pride. And so I took the job. I left Italy. I left kind of Roman ruins and long Italian sit-down office lunches every day, and I left riding my bicicletta on the cobbled streets and traded that for the new territories of Hong Kong, which pretty much borders the manufacturing engine of the world. And yeah, it was a culture shock in a big way. It was not just obviously displaced from my other environment, but also I was suddenly confronted by something I hadn't really expected, and that was just the scale of manufacturing in that part of the world and for the world, and hence being kind of exposed to just how huge consumption, the scale of consumption that exists in our modern world. And I thought my calling was to be a designer that just made stuff, without thinking. It was just a beautiful process of making. And then I thought that was my calling, and yet in Hong Kong and in China, I suddenly felt like that calling was being called to question. I should also mention that this is a photo by Edward Batinsky, who's a photographer who, at about the same time I was discovering, and he shoots incredible industrial landscapes, and some of them are completely desolate, and yet they can often be incredibly beautiful. And I feel like his work really colours, I guess, this tension that exists to this day within what I do. This sort of needing to create, and yet this acute awareness of what making the impact it can have, on the world. It's just, I find this image particularly haunting and incredibly beautiful and visceral at the same time. I should also mention this isn't China, this is Canada actually. These are nickel tailings in Canada. So likewise, my issue wasn't with China at all. My issue was just looking back. My issue was this massive disconnect between those making and those consuming, and that was, that was so profound. It was a really, really heavy time, as you may be sensing, and there was a lot of other things going on in my sphere of existence as well. I was in Hong Kong and China in the lead up to the Iraq War, and then subsequently through the whole, the invasion, and for some reason I was probably lonely, but I followed it with sick horror. And it was just awful. And then the SARS outbreak happened, so the whole region was suddenly on lockdown, and there was a lot of fear and panic, and so it was kind of like this triple whammy of dystopia that I was served at the time. So I left Hong Kong, I guess, in search of more meaning and to get away from all those dystopic tendencies, and I found more meaning in Tom Dixon, who I was very fortunate to be offered work with. This is an image of the pylon chair, which was designed in the 90s. It's probably my favorite piece of his work, and it's I think it's a perfect example of this spectrum between minimal and maximal. It's a completely reductivist piece in that it's an engineering structure, and yet it's obviously incredibly beautiful and incredibly sculptural. It's made from little 3.2 millimeter welding rods that are just tacked together, and every little triangulation is necessary to give it structure and strength. It's incredibly lightweight as well, so that the actual mass of the object is very, very little. So in that sense, it's kind of minimal and efficient, and yet it's obviously very, very expressive. It's super tall, it has those lovely kind of wingbacks that protrude forward, and just an incredible piece. And just as a bit of a side note as well, I think it's also really interesting is that it feels to me like it's 20 years ago, this is a precursor to this massive industrial shift we're witnessing now towards additive manufacturing. The only material that's used in the manufacture of this piece is what actually results in the object itself. So there's no chiseling away at a block of material for this. There's no tooling. It's effectively zero waste, and yeah, it's cool to look back at it now and just think actually it's kind of a precursor to all these FDM and SLA and SLS and SLM machines that are on our desktops or in the room next door or up the road. So yeah, kind of visionary, I think. So whilst my time in Hong Kong had made me aware that I needed more connection with these things that I was working on, these things that I was designing, it was my time in London that taught me more specifically about what that connection was actually to be to me, philosophically and aesthetically. And I owe a huge amount of that to Tom. It was, and I have to say though, it was a fantastic time, but it had started to become apparent that my time abroad was, it was set to be a return trip. I thought it was a one-way trip and came home and realized, or in London realized that I needed to come home. I kind of got to this point where I still yearned for the freedom to design everything in sixes, and Tom wouldn't let me do that. And I also needed to be back by the water again. I just had to be by the water. It was amazing. There's only so many times you can catch a train to go windsurfing on a lake near Heathrow where there's no wind before you really have to come home. So in 2006, late 2006, I came back and I guess wanting to create a more handcrafted practice, a practice that was that was more minimal essentially in terms of its footprint and more meaningful in terms of the work we did and the people we worked for. Speaking of footprints, it was always going to be cheesy. This is a shoe. It's a running shoe made from wool, which is designed for a small startup called 3/7, based out of Wellington. And I think I've chosen to show this image because it kind of represents a lot of projects, a lot of how we work on projects. And like everything, and like all the objects I showed you prior, this is the project. The approach to this started with stripping everything away. Trying to understand the sort of core essence of the product, whether it was the engineering or whether it was a detail. And we quickly came to realize that what was really special was actually the wool. And it's worth noting that the wool was developed by Ag Research here in New Zealand for, I think, the Australian Army or the Australian Police Force. I suspect it was the Police Force, I can't remember now. But it was a stab-proof material, so it was wool that was stab-proof. So Tim Brown, the client, would turn up with this little piece of wool and a pair of scissors, and you literally could not stab it. It's incredible material. It was probably a little bit excessive for footwear at the time. We were so strong we couldn't stitch it. So the design of that wool was actually a huge undertaking. But yeah, the other interesting thing about the wool is that it uses the mid-micron material. So it uses mid-micron wool is really only good if you're making carpet. So it was a really exciting opportunity to be able to use a resource that's kind of in abundance. And it's funny though, because this is actually a photo of a prototype. So the final production version is quite different. There's the little seam between the toe box and the sides of the upper is gone. And that little rubber reinforcement for the eye stays is now been internalized, so the shoe's become even more reduced than what you see here. And it's funny, we've spent sort of 2 or 3 years working on the shoe, and Tim Brown and the client and myself, we joke about how we spent all this time just designing a shoe that's nothing. And it's kind of true and it's kind of not, because when you zoom into the detail, we spent a huge amount of time trying to understand the wool itself. We had this kind of spectrum we would talk about that kind of ranged from either very technical and sporty to very kind of granola eating, felty, scruffy, and we kind of managed to achieve a bit of both. So internally it's really soft, and then it has this kind of technical, durable outer side that is pretty special in the end. We also spent a lot of time looking at the silhouette of the shoe, and it's a minimal running shoe as well, in that it's a shoe which has very little cushioning and very little heel rise. So it's designed to put you in closer contact with the ground, and there's a bit of a groundswell to this kind of approach to running, where you use the natural kind of biomechanics of your feet more than relying on cushioning and wedges and things that might sort of have other issues elsewhere. What else? I think that's enough on the shoe, but I guess the shoe for me is also emblematic of how we operate. I've sort of touched on that already. It's the result of collaboration and kind of cross communication, and it's not something that could have just come from within our office. It's completely reliant on multiple sort of talented companies and individuals. And our practice is 2.5 people. It's myself and my business partner Andy Jacobs, who is a total genius at just making things happen, and just a genius at doing. Like, I'm a Piscean dreamer, and I must just do his head in. but Andy is amazing. And then we have Reed, who makes up our half person, who may be here. I should be able to see him. Reed is actually a basketballer, so he's the tallest half person in the room. And so, yeah, like I've said, we're reliant on a much broader network of not just clients, but also practitioners and craftsmen and fabricators and manufacturers. And it's fair to say also that coming back to New Zealand, I was pleasantly surprised at just how fertile things are down here to do this kind of thing. To be fair, I'd come home thinking that a lot of the work I'd find would be abroad still, but that I could do it here on my own terms. But actually, it's not the case. This is a light that is being produced by Resident, a New Zealand furniture and lighting export brand run by Scott Bridgens and Simon James, and they are producing amazing work by lots of really talented designers and taking it to the world. And it's an incredible vehicle that I didn't expect to exist when I came home, to be perfectly honest. This light specifically, well, it's obviously an example of more maximal design. It's, if it was really going to be minimal, it would just be the diffuser tube in the middle and a light bulb, but that would also be, someone's probably done that anyway. So this is made from carbon fiber, and we have this lovely network of practitioners and craftsmen and people, and sometimes we even get to sort of cross-pollinate those people. And so this was built by an incredible composites manufacturer who normally does sort of high-performance boats and marine hardware and produces our kayaks. And to get him to produce this light was really, really cool. Chris Brown is, I always like to describe him as a bit of a tailor of carbon fiber. He's just that sort of amazing with his hands, and this light is no exception. It's kind of minimal in some ways. You could say that the material is minimal. It's made from carbon fiber, so it's incredibly thin and incredibly light, but because it's so light, it allows us to be really maximal in its size. So it's a little hard to see from this, but these lights are really large, and yet they don't need support wires or any kind of extra tensile wires, because they're just so incredibly light. So you can hang them without too much complexity. And they're just, they're very expressive in my mind, because they're these kind of radiating volumes that sort of intersect and slowly get kind of lighter towards the bottom and denser where we need to shield the light. So there's a sort of a practical kind of decorative thing going on there. And I'd just like to finish on this product. This is called the Eccentric Mobile. It's also produced by Resident. And the reason I want to finish on this is that I feel like it kind of represents where we've come to, where I've got to with my practice. It kind of has a joyousness and a lightness to it. It's dynamic, it's kind of forever changing, it changes with its environment, and these are all things that I feel like we do in our practice. And it's 4 little kind of polo stick shapes that are rotating around these little axes that are sort of all offset, so every time it spins it always finds a kind of a different sort of sculptural position to end in. And it was quite a challenge to achieve, but we managed to get there, and they're finally in production. What else? I think I have to reference Alexander Calder again here. It's clear that there's a lot of sort of balance, and a lot of his work in mobiles always fascinated me, and I always wanted to try and achieve a mobile myself. So albeit in my own kind of geometric language with multiples of 6. Sorry. There's a couple more things to say before we finish. The mobile is also another example of these Kiwi risk takers. So we're really lucky to work with people making shoes in wool, or people dehydrating paint pigment, or people taking furniture to the world in ways that you might not expect. And we've also reached a lovely point of trust with a lot of our clients. And I think there's a really funny story that goes with this mobile, and that's that I managed to convince Scott and Simon from Resident that this was a good idea, and they believed in me, and they were like, yeah, this is cool, let's do it. We'll take this hanging thing to Milan and launch it. And it was only, so we decided to build a prototype, and it was only literally weeks away from having the first prototype made that Scott and Simon realized that it was a spinning mobile. So they thought it was just this, I'd shown them these 2D drawings, and I think they just thought it was this hanging thing. So when they realized it was spinning, it was quite a revelation, and they were even more enthusiastic. And it kind of taught me that I need to get better at explaining my ideas sometimes. But yeah, I love that kind of, that they trusted me enough to do something seemingly stupid. it's a little less stupid than that. What else? That's pretty much it. That's a little snapshot of what we do. There's a lot more to our practice, and there's a website where you can see all that kind of stuff. But hopefully, what I've shown you illustrates the sort of tension that exists and that we operate within in terms of balancing the minimal and the maximal, in terms of how we design and approach an object, but also in terms of the clients we work with and the projects we take on and the results we try to achieve for them. And maybe even in a broader sense, it kind of illustrates the tension that perhaps we all sort of exist with and are confronted by as makers and creators and consumers. We currently have a lot of other projects on the go in the office, and I think we're at a really exciting time where it feels like we've kind of come of age. I feel like the work we're doing now is going to be some of the most defining to date, so I'll come back and tell you about that another time. We've recently moved our studio even into a little boat shed right down by the water's edge, which is, you couldn't literally be closer to the water, so it feels like really well and truly come home. Even managed to go for a windsurf between meetings last week after meeting Clark. So you definitely couldn't do that in central London. So yeah, I think that's everything. Thanks for listening, and happy to answer any questions. Have a nice day.